It's a collection of interconnected stories about one family of all women, a mother and her 10 immaculately conceived daughters. And they all have a curse over their head, every single one of the daughters, except for the last one, which is why the name of my collection is Ms. Webb's youngest daughter, because her youngest daughter does not have a curse. All right, so I'm going to read to you, this would be the second to last story in the collection that is in my thesis. What the Inanimate Have to Say. Irene walked past Edna's old room on her way downstairs, but stopped short when she heard one of the many voices leaking through the cracks in the doorway. Scores of blank canvases spoke of their nakedness, their cramped, stacked position. The bed complained of the dust gathering on its surface. The easel lamented of the lack of care of its wooden skeleton. She heard those voices every day walking past the door, muffled by the walls. But this time she distinctly heard another voice. "It's so dark and lonely in this closet," the voice said. "I'm supposed to see light. I'm an eye." An eye? "Please help me." Irene could barely hear the voice, coming under the other items in Edna's abandoned room, under the thunderous groans of their haunting house. This new voice confused her. She couldn't identify its source as she usually could. She opened the door. The smell of dry mildew hit her nose, almost a full year having passed since Edna died in here. Irene tried to distinguish the voice of the eye and the direction it came from, but all the voices grew louder. They always did when she tried to simplify or block out the noises. The cacophony was crazy, but Irene was able to find the eye's voice in the jumble of noise. "My corner hurts," said a canvas. "My wood is flaking, Irene," said the easel. "Dust me," from the bed. "Get out of my rooms," the hollow house reverberated. "Want to see the sun?" came from the closet. Irene crept to the closet, careful not to touch anything, stepping lightly on the hardwood floors. Delicately, she slid open one of the closet doors. She looked down into the darkness and saw a small box. It was the package of a camera lens. When Irene crouched down to pick it up, the lens moaned in the box. The box gasped when Irene's fingers touched it. Trying to be very gentle, she pulled up the top of the box. "Put me down! Don't touch me!" it yelled. She reached inside to take out the lens. It exulted at the light gracing its surface. Irene didn't understand. Why would Edna have a camera lens? She was a painter. "She bought me as a gift," the lens said. Irene's facial muscles relaxed in understanding. Edna died right around Hannah's birthday. Hannah had been a photographer. She died not long after Edna, nearly a year ago. Irene placed the lens on the floor in the path of the sunlight from the window. "Take off my cap," it demanded. Irene unscrewed the cap, careful not to do it too quickly. Then she left the room, the sounds of many inanimate objects following her. "Thank you," the lens said. Downstairs, in the kitchen, Gabrielle, their mother, was making Irene's younger sister's breakfast. Kyra, Mara, and Judith sat around the table eating fried eggs and bacon. Irene ate standing up, away from the bitching table, the pained chairs, and the sorrowing island. Everything was out of her arm reach. She ate her homemade trail mix slowly, delicately lifting each dried berry and nut to her mouth from her cupped hand. She had another doctor's appointment today. It was a requirement of the school. They thought she was crazy. Irene knew her mother hated taking her to that office. Dr. Subin had taken Irene off the antipsychotics. They did nothing for her. And now she was on mood elevators for the sadness of her lost sisters and anti-anxiety meds for tension of the voices. He had tried her on a dozen of different combinations over the years, and his office chair told Irene of his bafflement and frustration at the lack of success with all those different medications. Irene was sure that these drugs worked for other people with problems. Irene knew she wasn't crazy because she learned things from the objects that spoke to her. Dr. Subin said such surety was the real reason she wasn't getting any better. "Please sit down," Dr. Subin said. He motioned to a chair across from him. The chair, a stiff, modern maroon thing, spoke to her. "If you sit on me, you won't hear a thing he says. I just had an hour of some fat kid farting on me. I need a break." "No, thank you," she said. Dr. Subin sighed. "What is it said?" "That a kid was farting on it," she said. Dr. Subin turned his gray head to the side, his wrinkled eyes squinting at her. "You can smell it." Irene just stared back at him. "Please sit down," he said again. "I'd rather not." She stood to the side of the chair, looking at the brown carpet. She heard Dr. Subin sigh again. "Very well. What shall we talk about today?" "I found a camera lens in Edna's closet. I think it was a gift for Hannah." His pen screamed in pain as he wrote a note. "Uh-huh. And did you think about their suicides as a result of finding it?" "Well, I am now." Not really." "Do you still miss them?" "Duh." "Yeah, but Judith has been great. She reads to me to distract me. It helps me sleep." The pen kept screaming. The doctor asked, "And are you sleeping on a bed yet?" "No, I'm just on the carpet." "You need to make an effort, Irene. You'll never make any progress if you don't make an effort." Irene looked to the side, shaking her head. What effort was there to make? What would she make it for? There is no fighting this. Even now, everything in the room spoke to her louder than Dr. Subin could possibly. They all knew her name. They all cried out their agony to her, begging for her help. "No one cares what I have to say," complained the recorder. "I'm just supposed to tape. He never labels the tapes right anyway." "He's put too much other stuff on top of me," said the desk. "I'm dying under the weight." "Oh, my springs hurt," moaned his chair. Throughout all the other yelling was the wordless and rhythmic screams of the Newton's cradle. Irene's shoulders tensed a little bit more with each short yelp from the cradle. It cried throughout every one of her appointments. Apparently, Dr. Subin liked the clacking sound it made, because he seemed to always make sure the balls were crashing against each other. This was the most distracting object in the room. But Irene could not help any of the objects. She remembered as a little girl trying to stop her family, her teachers, her fellow students from using the objects around them. But it only put her here, standing across from Dr. Subin, trying to assert her sanity. He never spoke of committing her. She wasn't a danger to anyone. The voices made her timid. They trapped her in her own body, forcing her to be passive in this world of material objects, all of which Irene could hear howling out their terror and pain, begging her to release them from the tyranny of humanity. She gave up long ago. She knew too well how much of a benefit things were to the people around her. When they got tired, they used beds. When their legs wore out, they used chairs. To keep eating civilized, they used knives, forks, spoons, and plates. To communicate, they used pens, pencils, phones, and computers. To entertain themselves, they used TVs, video games, books, and balls. They all relied on the objects around them, for basic needs as well as needless activities. Irene knew she was a strange one. At school they called her the monk because her life was so austere, devoid of even a backpack or the books and notebooks required for class. Irene knew she would never lead a normal life, but she hoped that someday she could escape high school and Dr. Subin, escape Paradise Valley, escape Arizona, and move west across the Pacific to Tibet. She had pictures hanging up, hidden in her closet, of monasteries, of old monkish men sitting, praying, meditating. She had wanted to go since she was 7, the half point of her life, right after she was told that she would have to see Dr. Subin. The year before Judith was born, she saw a program that Abigail, the eldest sister, had been watching, which showed that monks in Japan had gone down into a hole and rang a bell every hour until they died, their body finally defeating their spirit's will to stay alive. It was called Soku Shinbutsu. She had read all she could on it, going to the ASU libraries when her school library and the public library didn't have much. She knew it was now illegal in Japan, but she felt like it was the only way out. She imagined that, enclosed in a tomb with no bell, she would finally understand what the word quiet meant. She was afraid to tell Dr. Subin of her plans for after high school, only 2 years to go. She was afraid that he would have her committed because She knew that Soku Shinbutsu was suicide. She felt that it was worth it. What was the point of living a life so full of pain, never having peace, never having happiness, hearing what no one else could, called crazy, and truly being on the edge of insanity at all times? She knew the voices were real. That wasn't where the danger of madness lay, but in the constant burble of noise around her, rising to a roar at times, falling to a murmur, but still there always. She may someday go truly crazy, possibly violently, so she must get out, away from people and objects, while she still had the capacity. I'm not stupid. I'm not mad. Yet. Irene sat in her room, alone. Her bedroom was bare of any objects, as if she hadn't moved in yet. The room used to be filled with items made for a baby. The walls were painted pale purple, the color her nursery had been. Gabrielle had told Irene that her first words had been, "It hurts," and had rushed her to the doctor, only to find out nothing was the matter with Irene. She had been an unhappy baby, never smiling and giving out baby gurgle laughs. And the first thing she had ever understood was pain, the pain of her baby toys, the pain of her crib, the pain of the house. All of that emotional hurt had been expressed to her before she could even speak. She knew that Kyra had the never-ending physical pain of a betraying body, and that Mara smelled nothing but the dog shit from the beasts that lurked in waiting patience for her to leave the house. And she knew by now that Judith was normal, but far from perfect, as Abigail had decreed all those years ago, hanging over Judith's crib. Irene, while distracted by the sounds around her, could see that Judith felt their pain, felt the loss of each sister more than any of them could, more even than their mother. Judith had only mourning in her life. While the other sisters were mourning the crushed lives they led, crushed by the curses over them, Judith had nothing but her sisters, and they were taken from her one by one. Because of her desire for Soku Shinbutsu, Irene tried to keep her distance from Judith. If Judith never became attached, then maybe when Irene died, Judith wouldn't feel it quite as painfully as she did the others. Irene sat cross-legged in the middle of her room, her eyes lidded. She could hear the muffled voices of the furniture. "No, don't sit. Let me go, please. Oh, God, why?" The crying voices burbled in all the rooms. "Get out! Get!" The house's deep, haunted voice seemed to vibrate the floors and windows. Irene felt sure she was shaking apart. Tomorrow was the 4th of July, a day when the screaming reaches at new pitches, almost splitting Irene's eardrums. The fireworks exploded over Echo Canyon Park, howling in horror as they died violently not far from the house. The other girls and Gabrielle would go to the park to watch the deaths, to ooh and ah over the beautiful slaughter. Irene would stay home, her hands over her ears. Every year was the same. The massacre was celebrated, and Irene cried over the loss. It was the day of greatest pain, and it came every year. A knock came on Irene's door, then it opened. Kyra peeked in her head, her small Hulk-like body hidden behind the door. "We're going to the Greenbelt," said the 12-year-old girl. "Would you like to come? We're not bringing anything. Thought we'd just walk around." Irene's younger sisters knew she loved the Greenbelt in their neighborhood. It lacked man-made objects. An empty field of green with a sparse amount of small trees, Irene's favorite place in the world because it was the quietest. Irene smiled slightly at Kyra, one corner of her mouth coming up. "I'd love to come." They walked sedately, followed from behind by a pack of mongrel dogs barking. Kyra seemed to flinch at each step she took. Mara's angelic face was contorted into a look of disgust, as if an invisible person held a pile of shit under her nose. Judith looked at the ground, watching her feet. Irene had an arm around Mara, shielding her from the dogs. When they reached the Greenbelt, they walked into the middle of the field and sat or lay down on the scratchy grass. The sun shone heavily over them, pinning them to the earth with the unblocked heat. They didn't bother to talk. Being the last 4 sisters of the 10 they used to be, The sorrow was too heavy to enjoy life, so they sat, Irene reclining down with her eyes shut to the sun, the blood of her lids bright. This was the closest she got to peace in this life. Around the green belt, the houses cried out in their deep voices, but it came across to her on the breeze, incomprehensible except for the emotional content of their words, pain. Her semi-peace was broken by coming voices, both human and inanimate. The human voices were joking and playful, male and female. She recognized them as older kids from her school. The object voices were those of Roman candles, illegal to have, like all fireworks in Arizona. She opened her eyes and sat on her elbows to see them, all about 50 yards away and coming closer. "Hey, it's the Webb freaks!" yelled out the eldest boy, whose name Irene didn't care to know. Her sisters watched the approaching group. The dogs barked at everything, not knowing if they should defend or attack Mara. Irene lay back down, but stared up into the sunlight, now apprehensive of what the group would do. They stopped some 25 yards away and spread apart from each other in a Wild West duel style. Two boys held Roman candles pointed at each other. "No, please, don't, I beg you!" the fireworks screamed in terror. But the kids could not hear the explosives' cries for help, for mercy. "Go away," Judith yelled at the group. They paid her no attention. Being twice her age, her significance mattered not at all. They each lit their Roman candle, extended their arms to point the end directly at the other person. "God, no! I don't want to die!" yelled the fireworks in their hands. Irene jumped to her feet. The Roman candles started exploding outward toward each other, screaming at each bang. "Stop!" Judith yelled. The kids laughed as they dodged the shooting Ferris explosions. The fire shot from the end of the candles, punctuated by small pops and loud screams, flying crosswise over the grass. Irene could not believe their callousness. She felt every explosion as a torturous blow, and she broke. She ran, her head down, and tackled one of the kids with a lit Roman candle. He fell to the ground. Her weight knocked out both the wind and the candle. She straddled him, yelling painfully, her face contorted in outrage. She put all of her righteous anger into the blows she rained down onto his face. The other kids stood still around her, shocked into inaction. Suddenly, two bulging arms hooked under her pits and yanked her off. She kicked out at the boy, landing one in his chest, throwing the person who picked her up off balance so that she fell back on top of her. When Kyra cried out in pain from Irene falling back on her, Irene realized it was her poor pain sister who had pulled her off. She immediately got off Kyra, who breathed and gasped, the hurt obviously in her whole body. "Kyra, I'm sorry," said Irene. "Are you okay?" Irene's hands hovered over her, she being afraid to touch her largely muscled body. "It's my bones," gasped Kyra. Irene started crying and looked waterily over at the boy she had attacked. He lay on his back, his face a bloody pulp. The voices of the Roman candles and houses howled around her, a tornado of sound and pain. It hurts so much." The boy's mother had called the police. Irene was to be committed. She had been declared a danger to society. It wasn't official yet, but all of them knew it was coming. The human voices of the Webb house were quiet, and the family didn't celebrate the 4th of July. Instead, Irene knew they sat on the couch in the living room while she hid in her empty room crying. Now she would never escape. Now she would never find peace. After the sun set on the holiday, the fireworks started dying in brilliant blasts of light over Echo Canyon Park. Irene heard their voices scream in horror, then fall away into silence. A chorus of pain, rising, building to a climactic massacre. They screamed and screamed, a cacophony of death. She covered her ears, breathed deeply, then in gasps. She sat cross-legged, rocking back and forth. "Make it stop, make it stop, make it stop," she whispered, tears running down her cheeks. Then she conjured up the sound of the bell. She pictured herself in a tomb, only big enough for her body. Like one of her precious months, She imagined herself with nothing, bringing about the sound of the bell with only her will. The bell that signified that the monk was still alive must be a beautiful sound, a ringing of life but also death, calm like the air inside her tomb. She heard the bell, not as an object being struck, but as a sound, low and long. It soothed her. The voices grew quieter. Her hands dropped away from her ears. She rang the bell again. The voices fell quieter. She breathed deeply and sat up straighter. She could feel it, the coming of death, her escape into peace. The bell rang again, low, long, falling gently into silence. The voices were stopped. It was dead quiet. Irene breathed deeply for the last time, a smile gracing her face. She sat frozen, a pillar of a person, inanimate forever.
That was really good. I like this story a lot. And all your stories are sort of similar in that there's a very strong narrative voice going on in these stories. And it's a strong voice, but it's also kind of a distant voice. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the advantages or disadvantages of having a voice that's far away from the focal character.
To some extent, thinking about these stories, I think about them as fairy tales. And but I'm not going to start these stories once upon a time, because that's too in that mode for me. So partially, I think my narrative style comes from that. Fairy tales are somewhat distant. Things are given in broad strokes, a summary, that kind of stuff. So, and you don't get too close to your characters. You know, they speak, they do things, but you don't get in their heads quite as much. But I wanted some of that. Sometimes, though, I want to be there. Like, for example, when Claudia and Delilah die, I try to get as close as possible. And usually it's their deaths that I try to get into their heads the most on, because I feel like it works best when I'm in their head in that moment. Also, that the moments leading up to it, what are they going through emotionally, you know? So that's what I feel like I gain a sort of etherealness from the distance, but at the same time I can lose some of the emotional content, which is why I try to get closer in certain moments.
And you might want to just really quickly tell people about the different curses.
Oh, yes. So there's 10 sisters. Abigail, the eldest, is cursed that she cannot sleep anywhere but standing up in front of a window. All right. Then Bethel, and she is really, really tall and hits her head on every door frame she meets. All right. And then after that is the twins, Claudia and Delilah. They switch bodies. And eventually, they no longer have control. You know, they just switch back and forth randomly. And then there is Edna, a painter, and every painting, when she finishes it and thinks, I'm finished, all the pigment on the painting just disappears. It evaporates into the air. After her is Hannah, who speaks in backwards pig Latin. So it's kind of interesting to read. Somewhat frustrating to read and write. And then after Hannah is Irene, who, you know, she would hear this podium speak to her. All right. She hears every man-made object talk to her. And then after Irene is Kyra, and Kyra is very muscular, and she swears that her muscles are eating her bones. After that is Mara, and Mara is absolutely gorgeous, just beautiful. But she's followed around all the time by dogs. And so
That's
all
not
she,
really a curse.
well, they bark all the time, and they smell terrible. So she always smells dog shit everywhere she goes. And she never gets a moment of peace because they're always barking, always, always, always barking. Even when she's in her bedroom, she can hear them outside her window. That's how bad it is. And then finally is Judith. Her curse is normality. And in the Immaculate Prologue story, I specifically say that her curse is normality. And it's the worst curse out of all the curses that the sisters have. All right, so those are the 10 sisters.
Very good.
Sure. Two things. This is a combo question.
Okay.
Your stories are set in Arizona, and they make use of magical realism. Could you talk about the interplay between locale and genre?
Yes. I find that the lighting in Arizona is tremendously magical and beautiful at the same time, and oppressive as well. Because in the morning, the sun comes up, it's got a beautiful sunset, and it's just so gorgeous, and some mornings you gotta wake up just to watch that sunset, and then sunrise, and sometimes you gotta watch that sunset because it's so gorgeous. And in the middle of the day, you feel as if the sun has its thumb on you, pushing you into the ground. It's oppressive, how bright it is. So I try to capture that in some of my stories. In Edna's story, there's a lot of sunrise and sunset going on because it's all about the beauty, because it's about art. And then in Judith's story, her house is oppressive. She goes outside. She feels the pressure of the light on her. It's very, destructive almost. And no one's ever outside. Usually in this one, you see some people outside. But very rarely, every time everybody goes out, there's no one on the street. There's no one walking because it's just too hot and too bright to go outside. So I try to connect that somewhat to the magic because I find it magical. I mean, obviously we know how the sun works and all that stuff, but it feels magical to me. So I try to incorporate that. Now the magical realism, I specifically kept it to their conceptions and their curses and dreams. Sometimes they have dreams, like Judith has a dream that's prophetic. Now, the actual magical realism of those things that I just mentioned is not necessarily tied to the locale. Those things could be movable, I guess. All right.
How many stories or short stories are missing from the collection, from what the three of us at least, read? And what do you find will add or change in those stories that you haven't written yet to flesh out the collection?
There are 6 stories left to write. A few of the sisters, so Abigail, Bethel, and Kyra and Mara, so 4 of the sisters, and then a story from Gabrielle's point of view, and a story from their neighbor, Mr. Fisher. So I figured I should give him a voice. And for the most part, the sisters' stories follow the same narrative arc for and it's the end pieces that are going to be the most different, that are going to slant the view of, looking forward and looking back. Obviously, you guys read them out of order, but yeah, that's how I wrote them. So for the most part, the suicides are going to be similar. Magical to some extent, realistic to some extent. Trying to explore how their curses affect them in the same ways I do in these other sister stories.
I was wondering, each story, though, sort of has a very similar narrative arc. They end with the suicide, kerplack. Is there any way, how does that sort of, how did you conceptualize that, and you think that's inventive?
Well, when I first wrote Immaculate, a long version that was supposed to cover everything for a short story class by Karen Stoltz, like 2 years ago. And I just started writing. And I'd already decided that they all died in the process of writing that story, but they just died. So then I thought, wait a minute, they all need a voice, so I'm going to expand this and write more stories. Of course, they still all die, so each one follows a similar path, but I was thinking, but they don't all die for the same reason. Even their curses have more meaning than just, oh, I run into door frames. They are representative of things that happen in the real world, real problems, like miscommunication, or isolation, not being able to connect with anyone, those kind of things, not being able to leave a mark on the world. So they all are experiments into why someone would commit suicide. So each sister handles their death differently, and the sisters all react to each sister's death somewhat differently. Gabrielle is the only one who doesn't act any different when someone dies, which is, I guess, the weird part, because she's their mom.
Any thoughts of incorporating a narrator into the action of your stories?
I typically believe that when I write, that the narrator is a type of god floating over the story.
Think highly of yourself there.
Well, the reason why is because I'm not one to put. I'm not a fan of first person in fiction. I mean, it can do wonderful things, but I don't feel it for myself. So I stick to what I feel is right. For the most part, when I write, I like to write fiction in a sort of poetic language, bringing in words and syntaxes that they wouldn't use. So that's why I do the floating god thing. But I like a focused floating god, because I want them to be on one person. If I spread it too far, then it doesn't become poetic, it becomes chaos. So I like that third person limited is what it's called. And so I prefer a narrator who keeps out of it. I don't like narrators who judge. So the narrator of these stories mainly is loving. Most of the characters are beloved by the narration. They're sort of stroked with the words, even though they die at the end.
Could you talk about other stories or other pieces of writing that you've used as a model, if you did that? Or other authors that you might take inspiration from?
I am somewhat influenced by Garcia Marquez. I started reading, haven't finished, The Autumn of the Patriarch, and he has these very, very, very long sentences, and they're very poetic and very connected. So for like Edna's story, I feel that more than like Hannah's story. Hannah's story is more choppy. So that one's more like An Evil Hour by Garcia Marquez. Thematically, funnily enough, I think often of Stephen King's The Drawing of the Three. I know it's a pop culture reference, but he deals a lot with identity in that book. So very psychological, and I'm very much into psychology. So I sometimes I bring that in on purpose, and sometimes it comes in totally by accident. Like when Judith eats the paper from her journal. It's very Freudian. I realized that after I wrote it. So for some extent, there is psychology in this, but also about midway through the process of writing this thesis, I started thinking a lot about Flannery O'Connor's style, how she tends to, it's different characters, they're not all connected, usually aren't, but they all kind of follow the same narrative arc. They're morally unsound, and they have a chance to find grace in God, and whether or not they find it, that's different. But almost every single one of her stories is like that. And so a lot of these stories, as Dr. White said, follow the same narrative arc. So I kind of thought about her for some, in the middle of this process. A lot of the times, though, my influences are not literary, but visual and auditory. I'm a very big fan of visual art and music. I listen to a lot of music when I write, and sometimes between writing stints I look at a lot of paintings. Like for a while there I looked at a lot of Leonid Efremov paintings. So sometimes I try to write like he paints, you know, very colorful, you're very vibrant, but at the same time somewhat sad because everything's raining all the time. So some of my influences are not in other literature.
Okay, does anybody else have questions out here?
Oh, in terms of your writing the magical realism, I picture the whole way through. I picture it as animation. Did you as well?
No, I didn't.
Okay, I'm just curious because the whole way through I'm thinking it's like Caroline. I'm like, it's an animated feature.
No, I try to picture real people, and as the more and more I write, the more specific everything looks in my head. I have a harder time getting all of those specificities on the page, which is what I'm working on, you know, for my own self. Yes, Megan.
How did you decide? I was in the original Karen Stoltz class of the original story, so I'm curious how you decided who got their own voice when you separated that.
Well, I decided that all the sisters should get their own voice. And you know, originally there were more sisters.
Yeah.
But I decided to cut the ones I kept forgetting. Because I realized if I was forgetting them, they weren't important. So they got axed, like Leah and Naomi. I actually remember their names now. And if you want to know their curses, one was, couldn't eat anything but wasabi and white chocolate. And the other one was born upside down and couldn't see the attraction in men, so she was lonely. Yeah. Like I said, I kept forgetting them, so I asked them. Yes.
I have a question about characterization and how you think about characterization in these stories. And what struck me is that, to me, your story felt similar to fairy tales in the sense that the characters seemed very iconic rather than having depth of characterization, psychological depth. I think of fairy tales, there's something intriguing about Red Riding Hood that I never feel, maybe other people read fairy tales differently, but I never feel like Red Riding Hood is a character I emotionally connect with or has psychological depth. And even though we keep hearing that Irene is frightened by all of these voices and so on, I didn't feel like, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I found her very fascinating in that she doesn't seem to have a kind of psychological depth, that she's this sort of iconic, emblematic character. So I'm just curious, from your point of view, do you see kind of traditional characterization as being important to your fiction, or?
For the most part, yes. But this is the newest story, so it has the least amount of work. It came out pretty well for what it was, but all my other works are much longer and have a little bit more characterization in them, I would say. But I was limited by the time I was allowed to read. So I chose this one because it was perfect. So for the most part, characterization comes for me in drafts. You know, I get closer and closer and closer until finally they're a real person. So at this point, Irene is sort of in the midway level, and as I probably write this again, it'll get closer. So I do find characterization is important, but at the same time, with these stories, I think it's important to keep some distance, not just for the fairy tale tone, but also because their deaths are not supposed to be tragic. You aren't supposed to look at Irene and go, that poor girl at the end. You're supposed to feel somewhat happy for her. Because the deaths are bittersweet. They're not, yeah, I know. They're not meant to be, You know, you're not supposed to go, oh God, Irene. You know, no, you're supposed to go, well, at least she got what she wanted. Because every single one of these stories is about what you'd be willing to die for. Not just kill yourself over, but what you're willing to die for. What's worth living and what is giving up everything you have. You know, so for Irene, it's that moment when everything is quiet. She doesn't experience the pain of the world anymore. So that's why the deaths are not supposed to be really close and you're supposed to be all like, oh my God. No, you're supposed to go, good. You know, you're supposed to feel some satisfaction that they died.
This is a two-part personal question. One, what has your family's response been to these stories? And two, which sister do you most identify with?
Okay, my mom is nothing like Gabrielle. She is a great mother. She is one of my best friends. All right, so she's nothing like that. In fact, my family haven't read any of these yet, although I know I sent copies of some of them to my sister. She may have read them. I'm not sure. She didn't get back to me. But I don't know yet. My mom wants a copy of my thesis, so she loves my work. She's always been very supportive. My family is tremendously supportive of my career, so I never have to worry about them going, oh, what are you doing? You're writing? No. They're like, go, Alex, go! That's their reaction to my work. They don't necessarily read my work, but every time I show up with work, they go, ooh, you know, and they want to read it. So they're very supportive. I imagine that they'll be very supportive of these stories, too. To your second question, I identify with all of them pretty evenly. Like Hannah's rage, you guys probably don't know this, but I understand that so well. Because I used to have a serious anger problem when I was a little kid. So I'm honestly past that. But I understand that sort of destructive, I can't even comprehend or speak rage. And then Judith, I get her obsession with how letters look. You know, I did that I went through a phase where I was like, I want my S to look pretty. And I did do the Celtic T, lowercase t, and it pissed off my teacher so much. So, I mean, like, and Gabrielle, I really identify with Gabrielle because she's a horrible mother. And I think I would be too. So that's where that, you know, that her horribleness is somewhat my idea of what I would be like as a mom. Which you're all going, no, you'd be great. I know, you're thinking it.
Well, one thing I noticed was that you made the sounds, like especially with the bell, you're making the sounds of the language, imitate what you're talking about. Were you doing that? I know you were conscious of it as you were reading, but what about when you were writing? Were you making language?
I try to write as poetically as possible. So yes, I was thinking about sound, and I was reading it consciously, that sort of slow, slumbery way on purpose. And I experiment with commas and dashes and all that stuff. And I think about alliteration and assonance a lot when I write, which I know seems weird for a fiction writer, but I think it's very important to painting a picture. Because that's, like I said, I want the vibrancy sort of Fremont's paintings in my work. So I think that comes from the poetic sound of my work.
One thing I was thinking about is you were talking about kind of the family dynamic, and it seems whenever you were talking about how many characters, how many daughters there are, and all that sort of thing, kind of like there's always the huge families that they'll have, and like the old mother, they'll live in the shoe and all that stuff.
Oh yeah.
I just wanted to know, how is it that you choose to have that kind of distance between the sisters because of their but at the same time they're so close, like they want to take Irene out so that she can have a little peace. How exactly did you try to develop that in each story? I mean,
each of the sisters is sort of isolated from each other and from the outside world by their curse, that they cannot connect emotionally to other people. Really, the only one who wants to connect to people is Judith. She tries her hardest to get her sisters to do stuff. I didn't have it happen in this one because I was getting tired of the trick of, it felt like a step I had to go through in each story, so I didn't do it in this one. But, she tries to connect to the sisters. She tries to help them feel better, which is why when she's the last one left, it's so terrible. She's so isolated. There's no one to connect to because Gabrielle hates her guts. So all of the sisters feel so different, so trapped in their own bodies, in their own lives, that they can't really connect to each other, to their mom, to the outside world, because it's just so different. They have nothing in common with anybody else they know. So why would they, why even bother trying to connect? And isolation, forced isolation, is a sign of depression, which they're all depressed to some extent, which I thought, I know that at some point I said the house is claustrophobic, but it's, the claustrophobia is more internal, even into their bodies, past the house even.
Are there any men other than Mr. Fisher, other than the neighbor?
Well, there's Dr. Sufin.
Oh, that's right.
I would say, there's there's Mr. Police Officer Johnson. He's in Hannah's story. And there's a guy in a bar. Not a lot of men. It's not purposeful. I'm not very feminist or anything. I just write what I know, and what I know is women. So, and also it's kind of about the absence of a father figure, so there's not, the closest they have is the neighbor who chops wood all the time. And that's it. That's pretty sad.
I was really entertained by that story, and it made me think a lot. And I was thinking, I kind of felt like that was a developed character. When you started to say you were sort of doing a fairy tale thing, I was like, I don't know, in that way, because I felt like there was a depth. Her big thing was empathy, and for everything, maybe more for objects than people almost, but she still even felt it for her sister. And I got that at the end, you're supposed to feel relief for her. But part of me was wishing for her to have some thought or epiphany, like, if a bottle rocket isn't going to be shot off, then what is its use? There seemed to be an idea about what is the point of things, and what is the point of her life if all it's for is to die. But a lot of times magical realist stories do that. They make you think about stuff that the story doesn't actually handle. But I did feel myself kind of like wanting her to understand a little more sometimes. But then again, I was really intrigued by it. My question was going to be what Jamie asked you basically, was had you solved this yet? And I was seeing a novel. Hearing you talk about it, and hearing Dr. White talk about it, I worry a little bit, since you haven't written all those stories yet, that arc that gets you to the death every time, or almost every time, might become a little formulaic for the reader. I was glad you said, we're going to hear from the neighbor. I almost was like, there needs to be a boyfriend for one of them. Or he's trying to be, and he's not going to be. Or maybe that house gets to snow. And so I just had all these things I was wondering about. And do we know why they're cursed? Because, I'm thinking about, Oedipus or whatever. It's usually always something the parent did. There's no good reason for it. You've got this horrible mother. So.
Well, what happens is on her 30th birthday, she goes to sleep, and a light fills her from head to toe, and then it centers in her womb, and she knows that she's pregnant. So that's their conception. It happens every time, and she's at some points she's like, God, no, not another one. And sometimes she's like, yes, please, I'm lonely for it. But for the most part, she doesn't actually mother her children. So she tries, but she's very bad at it. don't really have a reason for the curses. I don't really have a reason for how the conception happens. And the reason why is because I want it to be mysterious. I don't want it in there. You know, I don't want someone to go, that's the answer right there. You know, I feel like I should leave that to the lit critics to figure out if they want to.
Well, only if you write it somehow.
Yeah.
I guess I only wanted to say one more thing. Like, vaguely, I have in my mind a novel I read that I don't remember that well. But The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides.
Never read it. I've seen the movie.
Yeah.
But I've never
I
read
didn't
it.
see the movie, but it's a house full of girls that commit suicide.
There's
right?
5 of
But
them.
there's, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen the movie, like a 9-year-old commits suicide at the beginning, and then years pass, and then they all commit suicide together at the end. That's what happens.
Yeah.
One of them's not a virgin by the end, though, so I thought that was weird. But yeah, I've never read
It
it.
seemed like maybe in that there was more sort of, I mean, they do have some kind of impact on the outside and how other people see them seemed to be going on somehow. I don't know.
Well, there's a Child Protective Services and cops come to this house because girls keep dying in it, and they're
Yeah.
like, "Hey, what's going on?"
Yeah.
And then the girls basically drive them out. You know, so don't come back. We don't want you here. You know, our lives are terrible. You know, just let us be. It'll happen when it happens. You know, they're kind of, again, it's that isolation. They can't connect. So when someone comes to help them, they're just like, no. And also, like, the people come to help them, and they can't, like, say for Hannah, the people come to talk to her, and they can't understand her. So how can she even connect with them when she can't even communicate that she's in pain? So that's kind of why there isn't a lot of outside world interaction, because for one, they don't want it, and two, it's very hard for them to do so. Are we done?
Yeah.
I think we're done.